Hi, I'd like to use this lesson to explain the linguistic history of Masu. When I was first learning Japanese, I found it very hard to go between what I was told was plain form Japanese verb conjugation and formal form Japanese verb conjugation. You've probably heard these terms expressed in a variety of ways. Impolite Japanese versus polite Japanese, formal Japanese versus non-formal Japanese, colloquial Japanese versus formal Japanese, and so on. Most textbooks tend to treat polite and impolite Japanese verb conjugations as quite binary. When you use polite form Japanese, it seems as though verbs get an entirely unique form of conjugation. For example, why is the informal past tense of verbs ta, but the formal past tense of verbs is mashita? Let's look at hashiru, which means to run. Why is the informal past tense of hashiru hashita, but the formal past tense of hashiru is hashirimashita? Our poor Ashigaru friend, Mr. Takahashi, is also ever so confused. I'd like to use the video to delve into the linguistic building blocks and history of Masu. By understanding what Masu is, we can discover that the differences between formal and informal Japanese verb conjugation might not be quite as binary as first appears. With all of this said, let's charge into this topic. We tend to remember things much better when we understand conceptually what is going on. If you tried to memorize a song in a different language from rote, in a few weeks you would probably begin to forget it. Since lyrics are in a different language, your brain struggles to create links in your memory to the song lyrics. For all intents and purposes, the lyrics you hypothetically tried to learn are just pure gibberish to your brain. You don't understand the language, so you're trying to remember a set of sounds, rather than conceptually remembering the lyrics. When you actually understand the language a song is in, it is definitely easier to remember the lyrics. Think of the nursery rhymes you learned as a child. Until the day you die, you will probably remember parts of the lyrics to Old MacDonald Had a Farm. When you were a child, you were excited and interested in learning nursery rhymes, but importantly, your brain was beginning to understand its native language, and thus Old MacDonald Had a Farm wasn't a random set of noises. You weren't just learning nursery rhymes via brute force rote. The reason I've gone on this spiel is due to the following. If we can conceptually understand what Masu is, then by extension, the seemingly different past tense conjugations between formal and informal Japanese, ta and mashita, won't feel quite as arbitrary. I'm not the biggest fan of how some beginner textbooks, such as the Genki textbook series, presents the difference between formal and informal Japanese. There tends to be a binary division between verb conjugation. You conjugate a verb like this for the polite form, and you conjugate a verb like this for the informal form. This implies there's two separate systems of conjugation going on, which isn't quite the case. A more nuanced understanding is that there is no separate and unique polite form of conjugation for Japanese verbs. The polite form of Japanese verbs are just verbs that have had the auxiliary verb masu attached to the ren, yo, kei form of a Japanese verb. Mr. Takahashi seemed quite confused, as there was quite a bit of terminology in that last sentence, so let's break it down step by step. What is an auxiliary verb? An auxiliary verb is just a verb that supplements or adds more information to a verb. If you're a history nerd such as myself, you can help to remember it by thinking of how the Roman army used auxiliaries, soldiers from client states and tributaries, to supplement their army. An example of an auxiliary verb is to do in English. If you said, I did go to the shop, the verb did supports the verb go. Let's ignore the grammar rules of English and pretend you could say, I go to the shop. This doesn't really give us much information. Are you going to the shop now? Are you going in the future? Have you already been? To do here helps clarify that information. By saying, I did go to the shop, you can supplement the verb go and tell me that you go in the past. You did go to the shop. So, we now know what an auxiliary verb is. And I'll remind you now that masu is an auxiliary verb. Let's return now to the word renyoke. So I mentioned an auxiliary verb, and now I've explained what that is. But previously I mentioned the Renyoke form, so what is that? The Renyoke form is often called the Masu form of a Japanese verb. The reason for this other term, Masu form, is because it is easier to explain to beginners of Japanese, and it's obviously the form of the verb when Masu is put at the end. Let's take taberu, which means to eat. To put taberu into the Masu form, it becomes tabe. But wait a minute, what is Renyoke? Renyoke is made up of the 3 characters on the screen. It means something like connect, use, form. As in, the Renyoke form is the form of the verb that can be used to connect verbs. In this case, tabe, which is the Renyoke form of taberu, connects to masu, which is an auxiliary verb that supplements taberu, making it more polite. Tabemas, therefore, is the more polite form of taberu. That is why masu always attaches to other verbs in Japanese. For example, when you say tabemas, you haven't just created some random, unique new form of conjugation for the polite form. All you've done is taken taberu, removed the ru, and stuck masu on the end, creating tabemasu. See? Rather than thinking that Japanese has separate conjugation rules for the polite and impolite form, you now know that there isn't really a polite form. Japanese verbs can just be made more polite by attaching the auxiliary verb masu. I would like to talk now about how Japanese verbs without the masu are sometimes referred to as the impolite form of Japanese verbs. I think this way of framing is somewhat problematic. By telling you there is a polite and impolite form of verbs, textbooks can have the unintended effect of making you think there are huge grammatical differences between impolite Japanese and polite Japanese, when in fact, more accurately, polite Japanese is just normal Japanese, with certain auxiliary verbs chosen to make Japanese more polite in that context. There are no fundamental grammatical differences between Japanese formal and informal verb conjugation. Let's look then at what masu actually is. We know it's an auxiliary verb, but where did it come from? Masu historically came from the verbs maeru and su. Maeru is a humble verb. A humble verb in Japanese is used by the speaker to talk about their own actions in a more polite and humble way. Maeru can mean both come or go. Again, maeru is a verb with its own rich history, so I won't go into the etymology of it in this video. Su was a causative auxiliary verb. The causative is what it says on the tin. It tells you that the verb was caused. For example, let's take nomu. Nomu means to drink. When you conjugate it into its causative form, no maseru, it means cause to drink. For example, inu ni mizu o nomaseru. I will cause the dog to drink water. This sounds a bit stilted in English, so it's often translated into English as let or make. So that previous sentence about the dog could be translated instead as I will let the dog drink water, or I will make the dog drink water. So let's bring it all together now. So we take maeru, the humble verb for to go, to come, and then we take su, which makes a verb causative. So we have maeru and su. Interestingly, in the past, Japanese used to have a we sound, which is represented by this character. This sound no longer exists in modern Japanese, but historically, maeru and su was actually mawirasu. So, mawirasu could be translated as cause to come / go humbly, if we're being really literal. Over time, mawirasu contracted in the middle to become ma-suru. So we went from mawirasu to ma-suru. Maybe you can guess where this is going, because ma-suru became masu. When we listen to Oda Nobunaga speak, he ends his verbs with masuru. This is just another older form of masu.
武勇の誉れ高き貴殿にご挨拶を申し上げたく、さらに公正かつ公平なる連携を心よりお願い申し上げまする。
So, a very simplified chronology would be the following. In early Middle Japanese, 700s AD to the late 1100s AD, a Japanese person would say Mawirasu, but when we get to Oda Nobunaga, who spoke late Middle Japanese, the 1100s AD to the late 1500s AD, he would say Masuru. We then get to a modern Japanese speaker who would say Masu. So, when somebody says tabemasu, they haven't come up with any new polite unique form of conjugation. They are just using the auxiliary verb masu to make taberu more polite. And now we know that masu comes from mairu and su, which means something like to be caused to humbly go or come. So maybe tabemasu can be translated as I was humbly caused to go and eat, in a very literal translation. To wrap up then, let's return to the very start of the video. Why is the past tense of hashiru, to run, hashita, in informal Japanese, but hashirimashita in polite Japanese? Let's think of it this way. The Japanese language creates the past tense by making a ta sound, tabeta, hashita, owatta, and so forth. This also applies to verbs that end in a su sound. Nakusu, meaning to lose something, becomes nakushita in its past tense form. See how the ta sound is still at the end. Masu conjugates entirely in the same way as any other Japanese verb that ends in su. So, nakusu became nakushita, so too does masu become mashita, mashita in the past tense. So we take hashiru, put it in the renyo kei form, also known as the masu form, which makes it hashiri. This then prepares the verb to be connected to something, masu. The auxiliary verb is then connected to hashiri, making hashirimasu. But let's say we wanted to turn hashirimasu into the past tense. We just conjugate masu. We know we need to put a ta sound at the end of masu to make it past tense, so we turn masu into mashita, leaving us finally with hashirimashita. As we can see, there aren't two unique systems of Japanese verb conjugation occurring separately for informal and formal Japanese. Hashita and hashirimashita hopefully no longer seem arbitrarily different or entirely disconnected. Thank you for watching, and I hope this will help you to remember and understand what masu is a bit better. The main point I wanted to get across is that masu isn't part of some otherworldly, alien grammar structure that magically makes Japanese more polite. It is just a simple, humble auxiliary verb that makes a Japanese verb more polite.